Hey everyone, Dean here. Today will be the first video in a 3-video series on how to use the HUD effectively, what the HUD stats mean, and how to use the pop-up menu in-game in order to get the best results and exploit our opponents to the maximum. So jumping right into it, I just want to go over the HUD stats that are most important and we're going to use to formulate our strategies most often in preflop. So these are the stat names, and this is the minimum sample size that we'd like to see in order to start relying on that stat as evidence to support our hypothesis in order to take a certain action. So sometimes things get messy, especially if you play Zoom, and you're not always going to get to these minimum hands. And it's not as though we can't use these stats, but they're going to be a lot less reliable without the minimum number of hands that we need in order to use them. So the first one is pretty obvious, PIP, voluntary put money into the pot, and the minimum number of hands that you want to distinguish a fish is about 20. And to distinguish between a good reg, a recreational player, or a nit, you're going to need about 100 hands. The same is true for PFR, which stands for play for raise. The third stat that we're gonna use all the time is 3-bet. We're gonna need at least 100 hands in order to start seeing 3-bet ranges. Fold to steal, which is how often somebody folds to a raise from the cutoff, button, or small blind. Really important. And conversely, there's attempt to steal, which is how often somebody tries to raise first in and steal the blinds from the cutoff, button, or small blind. You need 80 hands for the fold to steal, 100 hands for the attempt to steal. The next stat we're going to look for is fold to 3-bet. We're going to need at least 8 opportunities to start using this reliably, and we usually gather that around 100 hands. So the next stat is 4-bet ratio. We're going to need at least 1,000 hands in order to properly use this stat. Then fold to 4-bet. Again, we're going to need around 1,000 hands before we can start to reliably use this stat, which usually is around 6 opportunities. We're also going to want to know how often a player will c-bet the flop. We usually need about 100 hands or 10 opportunities for that. And how often they'll fold to a flop c-bet. Even though these are obviously flop stats, not pre-flop stats, they're really important in formulating a strategy, how we're going to approach a pre-flop situation, and what we're going to do on the following street. The HUD stats we want to use and be looking for when we're deciding to raise, steal, or isolate a limper is going to be the fold to steal stat, the 3-bet stat, and the fold to flop c-bet stats. The higher a player's fold to steal and fold to flop c-bet stats, the more often I'm going to steal and the more often I'm going to fire a bet on the flop if I am called. The higher a player's 3-bet stat, the less often I'm going to attempt to steal, since my junky hands are not going to be able to withstand a 3-bet and I'm going to end up losing my steal attempt. So this is a really important concept in just checking the HUD stats before we make an action. I have an example right here for us. This is a pretty basic one, pretty simple. The HUD I'm using is Nathan William, Black Rain 79's full HUD. There will be a link to it in the description of this video. And I've been using this HUD since I started using a HUD, and it's been very, very effective in displaying all the information I could possibly need very quickly to me, and if anything I need to really dive deep in, I can always use the pop-up menu. So the stats we're looking for are fold to steal, fold to flop c-bet, and 3-bet. So we can see this opponent in the blinds has a fold to steal of 70. The optimal stat for this is about 72, so this opponent folds to a steal a little bit less than optimal. This opponent has a 3-bet of 5, and the optimal stat for this is 8, so this is a little bit less than optimal. So this is a good reason why we should steal, because we're not going to get attacked super often. Our opponent over here has a fold to steal 79 and a 3-bet of 9, slightly more than optimal, but definitely slightly alarming. But with a hand like 8-9, we'd definitely still want to go ahead and try to make the steal attempt anyway. The last thing we want to check is fold the flop c-bet, since we'd want to steal less, especially if people fold to flop c-bets less. A person could have a fold to steal of about 30%, but if they still fold to a flop c-bet 60 to 70% of the time, our steal is still going to print money, since we're still going to be able to just steal the pot on the flop so often. So this is a pretty standard and basic example of the thought process I kind of go through before I make a steal attempt, and this is a pretty standard open, even if these guys are even a little bit more aggressive or folded a little bit less to steals. So moving on, we have to check how often a limper folds to a raise after limping when we're attempting to isolate them. Their fold the flop c-bet stat is also incredibly important, since most limpers are not going to fold when we isolate them very often, especially once we start pounding on fish and isolating their limps very frequently. So I have another example of this right here. Here we have a very junky looking hand, but we do have a limper directly to our right in the cutoff. So the first thing we want to check is how often this limper folds to a flop c-bet. This limper has folded to a flop c-bet 4 out of 4 times, over 140 hands. So this is a great opportunity for us to isolate. We can also check how often they limp and call a raise. We can use this. This is the first time we're going to be using the pop-up menu. We just have to left-click the HUD, and you can see it right here under the Tools tab. This opponent limps and calls a raise only 60% of the time. So our isolate here is certainly going to print us a ton of money. The last piece of this puzzle is the opponent's left to act, specifically the opponents in the blinds. Both of the opponents left are good regulars. They 3-bet fairly frequently. They probably are positionally aware when they 3-bet, meaning they're going to target button raises and especially isolates a little bit more often. And we just want to do the same thing we did in the previous hand, checking their fold to steal, their fold to flop c-bet, and their 3-bet stat. None of these guys go super crazy, super out of line. I usually stop trying to steal pretty wide once people's 3-bet stats get to around 10. So this is a great slam dunk opportunity to isolate. So moving on to the last part of this section is we need to make a plan for what we do when we steal or when we open pretty much from any position and when we're called or 3-bet. So this goes into the fact that we already started checking the flop c-bet stats. We already started checking how often we're going to be 3-bet, but we should already have an answer to how we're going to respond to a 3-bet, how we're going to respond to somebody calling before we even make the action in the first place. So what to look for when we're facing a single raise. So this time somebody is raising us. We're going to want to check their attempt to steal stat, and we're going to want to open up their pop-up window to check their raise first in for whatever position they might be raising from. So say somebody opens from early position and they have a PFR of 20. So we shouldn't just assume they're going to have a 20% range from early position, as usually ranges get tighter the further away you get from the button. So we can open the pop-up tab and actually see how often he's raising first in, or his general PFR, from early position. And we can see maybe it's only something like a 10% frequency. So he only has a 10% range when he's raising for this position. So we need to be especially tight. And some players might have a 20 or 22% range. So they're actually raising more frequently from early position for whatever reason that might be. So the most important thing is always just to check. We also want to check how often opponents fold the 3-bets. And we can use the pop-up menu again to see how often they'll fold to a 3-bet in a specific position. Players usually fold to 3-bets less if they would raise from early position, because their range is going to be tighter, and they know that people raising under the gun ranges are also usually going to be stronger ranges as well. But when somebody raises from the button, they might fold more often to a 3-bet from the blinds because they're going to be stealing with a much wider range, and they're not going to be able to continue as often. So it's always important to check using the pop-up menu, which I'll show an example of in a second, how often people fold to 3-bets based on the position they're raising from, not just their overall fold to 3-bet stat. Although if we don't have time, as we sometimes do multi-tabling in today's games, we can always just briefly glance at our HUD and try to make a sophisticated decision using that. So if you would be in position post-flop, it's also important to check how often your opponent c-bets the flop, and check how often the opponent folds to a flop float or a turn float. One of the best ways that you can get an advantage over regulars nowadays is just to float them all day long. Lots of regulars have a very hard time adjusting. I know I still have a fold to turn float leak. Lots of regulars do. And so we always want to be looking to call cutoff bets or middle position or early position bets on the button or possibly in the cutoff, and look for opportunities to float our opponents and steal the pot away from them. So we have another example of what to do when facing a raise. Here we have a pretty clear-cut example with ace-2 in the big blind. It folds to this aggro fish who decides to raise it to 3x. So the first thing we notice is his attempt to steal is 71%. So this person is stealing just about every chance they get. Only 50 hands, so not a huge sample size, but we're definitely able to draw some conclusions from this right away. We can check how often they try to steal from their position, and we can see this person has raised 8 out of 8 times from the small blind. So whenever they have the option to raise first in, this person raises first in from the small blind. And the last thing we want to check is how often this opponent folds to a 3-bet. And this opponent folds to a 3-bet 80% of the time. And so this is a slam dunk, no-brainer 3-bet. This is a perfect opportunity to exploit our opponent and just take the pot away without even having to see a flop. So we raise, and I'm guessing he folds. He does fold exactly like that. So in this example here, we have a regular opening from the button, and we have to decide if we want to 3-bet, call, or fold. So this regular doesn't attempt to steal very often at 26%, and doesn't fold to 3-bets very often at 54%. But what we do have going for us when making a 3-bet is how often he folds to a flop c-bet. So he's folding to a flop c-bet almost 70% of the time. So even if we do get called, we're going to be able to take the pot away very easily on the flop, and our 3-bet will still be profitable even though he doesn't always fold. It's actually more profitable when they call and then fold on the flop. So the last thing we want to check is just to make sure that he has a pretty wide range on the button. He does at 32%. And when we check the flop, we can look at 3-bet pots and see how often people are folding to 3-bet pots in these situations. This person folds to a 3-bet or a c-bet in a 3-bet pot 75% of the time, even more than his already high fold to c-bet on regularly. So this is a slam dunk 3-bet and attempt to take it down on the flop. Just folds this time though. So moving on to our last section here is, what are we going to do when we're facing a 3-bet or a 4-bet or a 5-bet? So whenever we're facing a 3-bet, we just want to check how often our opponent 3-bets from his position and how often he 3-bets versus our position. We're going to need to open the pop-up tab for these stats. So I have an example right here, but I guess I'm going to continue this because it's a 4-bet example too. So we're also going to want to check how often our opponent folds to a 4-bet. And the more they fold to a 4-bet, the obviously the more 4-bet bluffs we want to work into our range. If our opponent is an aggro 3-better and does 3-bet quite frequently, especially versus the blinds or the cutoff, but doesn't like to fold to a 4-bet, the wider we want to make our 4-bet value range, starting to include hands like 10s, jacks, possibly even ace-queen suited, etc. So when we're facing a 4-bet, we definitely want to check our opponent's 4-bet ratio. The higher the 4-bet ratio, the wider our opponent 4-bets, meaning that we can 5-bet lighter or call lighter. Although I'm a 5-bet or fold kind of person, I don't usually call 4-bets in 100 big blind poker. So basic 4-bet ratios. 1 means you only have the nuts, aces, kings, and sometimes ace, king, and queen, queen. If they have a 4-bet ratio of 2, it means they have some premiums and a few bluffs. This is where most decent regulars are. They're in between 2 and 3. 3 has a good amount of bluffs, and 4 plus is they're a maniac, and they have way too many bluffs in their 4-bet range. So the first example we have here is ace-3 on the button. We decide to steal for a lot of the reasons that we talked about before. And this regular decides to 3-bet us. So the first thing we want to do is check how often this regular 3-bets us in these positions. So this regular 3-bet by position, 3-bets 8% of the time from the small blind, and 3-bets versus a button open 15% of the time. So this guy is going to have a very wide range 3-betting us here. So that means that we can fight back with more hands, and suited aces are very good candidates to 4-bet bluff since we block aces and ace-king, as well as having a lot of equity versus all the smaller pocket pairs like kings, queens, jacks. And the suited aspect gives us more outs, and the wheel aspect gives us a nice little straight draw as well. So this opponent only folds to a 4-bet 50% of the time. We have a pretty good sample of 6 opportunities over 1,000 hands, so we can pretty safely say that this opponent's going to fold to this 4-bet attempt half the time if we decide to make it. Now, this won't always work out, and he's going to jam over us and call us a decent amount of time, but it's important to work in at least some bluffs into our 4-bet range, even when people don't fold too much, just to balance our range and make sure, our aces and kings are going to get paid off. So we do decide to make the 4-bet. I recommend making it about 2.2 times the size of the 3-bet. That way we can still fold if our opponent comes over the top of us. So we bet, 4-bet, and thankfully our opponent just folds, and we win a nice little pot there. So the last example we have today is a spot where we are going to be facing a 4-bet. So we have pocket jacks in the small blind. This regular decides to raise. He usually folds to a 3-bet. He has a fairly high stealing range, I believe. 30% raise first in from the cutoff. The fish calls us on in this button, and we decide to make a really standard 3-bet here. We probably should make it a little bit more, but that's beside the point. And then our opponent decides to come over the top and make a 4-bet. So when I'm getting 4-bet, the one thing I want to look at is the 4-bet ratio, which is right here. And just like we went over a minute or two ago, his 4-bet ratio is pretty low. A 1.44 bet ratio is going to be aces, kings, sometimes ace-king, and queens. So pocket jacks is absolutely crushed by this range, and there's absolutely no chance we can continue. If there's some history between you and an opponent that has a small 4-bet ratio, if you've been 3-betting them very often, we usually can put them on a little bit wider of a range. But when you're facing a 4-bet ratio of 1, we need to be very cautious with hands like jacks, like 10s, like ace-king, and even queens when we are getting 4-bet, since they almost always just have the nuts. So the best idea here is just to lay it down. That covers everything I wanted to talk about in this video. I hope this helps you guys use your HUD effectively in making decisions before the flop, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next video about how to use your HUD on the turn. Take it easy, guys. Talk to you later. Have a nice one.